Hello and welcome to another Times Radio Members Question and Answer. Today we're answering questions from our channel members on Frontline episodes and other videos about the war in Ukraine and its impact on the world stage. I'm Philip Ingram, a former senior British military intelligence officer and now commentator across the globe on all matters conflict. Our first question comes from Robert. Now Robert says, in talking about US support into Ukraine and permissions to use weapons, too little, too late. Remember, America hasn't won a war since 1945. Once again, the Americans just don't get it. And I think he's referring here to Joe Biden's delay in the permission to use long-range weapons and other weapon systems into Russia. Maybe Trump can teach them something. Well, it's interesting. And when you look at history and you look at what we're doing at the moment in our analysis for the war in Ukraine, too much analysis is based on what is happening purely on the front line. Who has taken a few tens of meters or hundreds of meters or even kilometers of territory, and what's the balance between what each side has done? That's the tactical battle. Now, a tactical battle will set the conditions for operational level and strategic level decisions. So if you've got something that's decisive, that overthrows higher level military commands, overthrows governments, which Putin had tried to do in the first place in his attack into Kyiv, then that has strategic significance and will dictate the outcome for the war. However, what we're seeing at the minute is on the front lines, effectively, even though the Russians are advancing slowly, the cost is huge for them, and it's not got any strategic significance when it comes to understanding who's going to win the war at this moment. We think back to Vietnam. The Americans won every tactical engagement they were involved in Vietnam. They didn't win the conflict. This conflict isn't going to be resolved at the tactical level. However, that will set the conditions for what happens at the operational or the strategic level. So the biggest issue at the moment is manpower. The Russians are losing, according to Defence Intelligence this week, UK Defence Intelligence this week, 1,500 personnel a day, and they've done that through the whole of 2024. That's unsustainable for anyone. Ukrainians, we don't know what their casualty statistics are, but it's not going to be far off that. Probably about 50% of it, but again, it's difficult to tell. And they're losing huge numbers of pieces of equipment. That's having an impact. That's having a strategic impact. And at some stage, the leaders of Russia and Ukraine are going to have to say, we can't sustain what we're doing. That's when you get to a stalemate position at a strategic level, and that's when negotiations will happen. So the war is not going to be won or lost on the tactical battlefield and how much the front lines move. It is going to be won and lost on what those tactical battles, how they affect what's going on in the wider economy in both countries, and what that then forces the leaders to be able to do whenever they get to negotiate. Of course, each side will inflate what its capability is and how long it can continue with the battles that are going on. From my perspective, analysing everything, with the level of support that's coming in from the West to Ukraine and the level of support that's going into Russia, Russia is hurting more than Ukraine is. And we can see that in Russia now relying on North Korea for ammunition, North Korea for manpower, Africa with the Wagner Group heavily recruiting across Africa and elsewhere, China for taking exports, in particular oil, and India taking oil, but China for high-tech capabilities to go into Russian weapon systems, and of course Iran for some sophisticated weapons, including the Shahad 136 drones that are coming in. So Russia is hurting at the moment, and that will have an impact when it comes to the forced negotiations that I think Donald Trump will bring onto both sides whenever he becomes president. We'll sit and watch this very closely and bring you more detail as it comes. So the next question comes from Joshua, and actually this isn't just from Joshua. There's a number of people, having scrolled through the different questions, that have asked the same or a similar question. And what Joshua says is, Trump's going to try and implement a ceasefire and freeze the conflict, giving Putin all of the territory he's captured so far. And let's not kid ourselves and pretend that we don't know what he's going to do. He has told those in the circle exactly what he's going to attempt to do. And if we're cool at giving Putin what he wants in the name of peace, then we're actually winning. This sounds like the dumbest plan. It is a particularly dumb plan. Since it sounds like the dumbest plan our leaders have ever come up with. A frozen conflict only guarantees a world war as an axis is formed now, and that's not just going to go away with peace talks and concessions. There's a lot in that, Joshua, and it's a very, very pertinent point. If Zelensky is forced to give up territory, and it's interesting, he has offered to temporarily give up territory for a peace plan and NATO membership, but if he's forced to do that, the implications that has with other global leaders who've got territorial ambitions, and here I'm particularly thinking about Xi Jinping in China with his ambitions over Taiwan. If Zelensky is forced to give up territory, then that will probably stimulate Xi Jinping in saying, I can now take the chance of taking Taiwan by force and deal with the international implications afterwards. Xi Jinping's preparing for it at the moment. He's stockpiling oil, he's stockpiling food, he's stockpiling medical supplies, he's increasing his manufacturing capability, he's increasing his defense manufacturing output, he's watching very closely what's going on. So he's setting the conditions to be able to withstand an economic shock or a natural resources shock for a period of time. And therefore, it's quite clear that he's preparing for the potential of taking Taiwan by force. But actually, I don't think Trump is necessarily going to force the Ukrainians to give up the territory that Russia has captured at the moment. I think there's some very clever diplomatic discussions going on at the moment and diplomatic games going on at the moment. And it's quite clear that Trump or Trump's team has spoken to Putin's team and Zelensky's team. Of course, Putin's team have denied that that conversation happened. But Trump said to him, don't escalate. We've seen an escalation with the use of medium-range ballistic missiles and intermediate-range ballistic missiles by the Russians. We've seen Zelensky, after Trump's talked to him, coming up with a peace plan where he's saying he's willing to trade some territory, but for NATO membership, not a guaranteed peace arrangement, but NATO membership in the areas that are not occupied by Russia, and he will then look at negotiating the return of that territory at some stage in the future. The diplomatic games are ongoing, and that's before Trump has even got into position. I think what will happen is that Putin will entrench himself and go, I want the territory that I've got, and I want more. He wants the Donbass. He wants to get control of the whole of the Donbass, and he will go hardline in that. Zelensky will go hardline on NATO membership, knowing full well that actually NATO's constitution doesn't allow a country to become a NATO member whilst it's still in a conflict position, and negotiate the return of territory at some stage in the future. That will put Trump in a difficult position because he will have to decide whether he backs Zelensky or he backs Putin. And I think when it comes to it, if we look at the output of the discussions that happened between Trump's team and Putin's team, I think Putin was upset because they denied that a conversation had ever happened. But then just after that, they published naked pictures of Melania Trump all over Russian national television. And that, if you look at Putin's psyche and Putin's background, is an old Russian intelligence officer's way of threatening, of saying, if I'm going to compromise your wife currently, what else have I got on you? And be able to put that out. Trump's response to that, he's been very quiet at the moment. We haven't seen anything. But that doesn't mean to say that there's nothing going on in the background. And clearly Zelensky is very carefully playing Trump, and he's coming up with the, I'll negotiate, I'll give concessions, and Putin's entrenching himself. I think Trump will come in and give the Ukrainians and give Zelensky the wherewithal to hit the Russians hard and hurt them hard. And that may be through supplying the Ukrainians with more capability. It may be through forcing elements of NATO to give additional support to Ukraine, which is where I suspect it will go to. But something will come in that will push Putin even further and try and force Putin into a negotiating position. Putin's not in a strong position at the moment. Militarily, he's hurting. As I've said before, He's relying on North Korea for manpower, for ammunition, and other material. He's relying on China. He's relying on Iran. He can't generate enough manpower. His economy is just about to go into free fall, and that will affect Putin's decision-making enormously. We're at that tipping point at the moment. When it's going to come, it's unclear. I think it will come in 2025, and that's when things will get to their culminating point, and we'll get negotiations. That culminating point will not be a battlefield tactical decision point. It will be a strategic inflection where Putin is forced to come to the negotiating table and give concessions. He's not there at the moment. So the fighting that's going on will help set the conditions for that to happen. A lot more to come in. We need to see what Trump's next move is after these initial clashing of the two heads together. So our next questions come from Thor, and he says, or his comment is that Russia got away with invading Georgia in 2008, stealing their land, building 2 permanent military bases, and ending the war in only 16 days. It's the sole reason they could get away with it again in Ukraine. That's a very valid point. And if we look back historically, Russia did get away with an awful lot of atrocities in Georgia and across the Caucasus, and the West sat there and did nothing. And if we look at what happened whenever Russia first invaded Ukraine in 2014 by the little green men capturing Crimea in a bloodless maneuver, very, very clever military operation. But again, the West did nothing. If we'd reacted then, it would have put Putin on the back foot, but we did nothing. But really, taking those into context, I think those set part of the foundation for Putin's action into Ukraine. The final bit that solidified that foundation was the West's debacle in Afghanistan. And what Putin saw was the West being embarrassed by the Taliban. He saw the West becoming more inwardly focused and licking its wounds after, in the UK, it was up-pitting the evacuation from Kabul and the American operation going on at the same time. And the pictures of individuals falling off the outside of aircraft as they were taking off from Kabul airport and the desperation that there was in people's eyes. Putin saw that and thought that the West would be licking its wounds and trying to recover from that and not be in a position to get involved in another international affair. And therefore he saw that as a green light and an opportunity for him to make the decision from threatening Ukraine, as he had done on several occasions with major exercises around the border. And he turned one of those major exercises into the pre-deployment for the actual re-invasion almost 3 years ago. And if we had been more robust in 2014 with what happened in Crimea, and we had been more robust in the comments that were coming out politically post-Afghanistan and didn't seem as weak as we did, then I think that would have put Putin off. We have to remember that analysing our view of Afghanistan and the takeover of the Taliban, putting this into British context, I think that was probably the single biggest intelligence failure since the fall of Singapore in 1942, because we should have seen this coming. But from a strategic perspective, for some reason or other, we didn't, and that lesson hasn't come out. That's what triggered Putin from an opportunistic perspective to go, now's the time for me to move into Ukraine and to stop Ukraine's further move into closeness with the EU and with NATO. He failed in that strategic objective when he failed to take Kyiv and topple the Zelensky government. That's why everything that he's doing now is an alternative main effort that he's dreamed up to try and give him something that he can sell to the Russian people and to those that support him internationally, China, North Korea, Iran, the wider BRICS community, that Russia is still a global strategic power. He's not, and we'll see what the fallout of that is through 2025. And our final question or comment today is from David, or David and Melody. And it's the lack of European support for Ukraine is disgusting and the beggar's belief. NATO and others simply stood by and watched Putin lie and bully anyone and everyone around him. What is a tokenistic, sick joke. In a way, you're right, David. Europe has been on the back foot, and Europe's membership of Ukraine has been on the back foot, and that's from Trump's first presidency right through until today. In his first presidency, he recognised that many European countries were not contributing the 2% of their GDP to defence that they'd signed up to as being members of NATO. And therefore, he forced the hand. He threatened to withdraw from NATO or threatened not to participate in an Article 5 operation, should that be something that came in. If you don't pay, we don't play, is his comment. And I think he'll continue to do that. I think we're seeing European support for Ukraine growing. Germany is the second largest contributor. UK is now the third largest contributor. France is beginning to contribute more, and that's getting in there. But there's a lot more it can do to try and take over from what the United States is doing, or complement what the United States is doing. I think part of the problem behind this is because Europe has been bluffing itself as to what it can actually do. If you look at the length of time it's taking for a lot of the equipment that's been promised to actually get to Ukraine, it's coming out of storage, it has to be refurbished, it then has to be put into training for the Ukrainians and sent forward, and the support packages have to be put together. It's taking months to refurbish the equipment, to get it from storage, to get it operational. That doesn't say much about how it's been kept in storage. And then when we come to our defence industrial bases, looking at the capacity output from those manufacturers that are producing not just the military equipment, but ammunition, the basic stuff, and in particular 155mm artillery shells, it has not been able to match the usage that the Ukrainians are having to use to try and deal with the Russians on the front line, giving shortages of artillery ammunition on the front line. That's impacting Ukraine quite severely. And therefore, I think the lack of European support has been down in some way to the fact of Europe has not had that support there. It has not had that capability there, but it doesn't want to admit that publicly. That's improving now. And I think with the new Trump presidency coming in, we'll see additional pressure on Europe, and we'll see Europe's manufacturing capacity, and I include UK's manufacturing capacity in that, having to grow and having to increase. And we're beginning to hear the noises out of the UK's strategic defence review that's happening to suggest that the defence industrial base is a key part of what the outputs of that are going to be. But again, it's something we have to monitor closely. It's good to hear it being talked about. We had got into a very, very embarrassingly weak position beforehand. That's all for this question and answer session. If you want your questions on the war in Ukraine and its impact answered, please sign up for Times Radio membership today. And thank you very much indeed for watching, and I shall see you next week.